Only I came to my husband's funeral. Not our son. Not our daughter. Not a single grandchild. Just me, standing beside the coffin while the wind tore through the courtyard, sharp and unforgiving. It pulled at my coat, pressed against my chest, carried the sound of rattling branches overhead like something restless, something impatient. The funeral director hovered nearby, eyes flicking toward the empty rows behind me. He cleared his throat. "Would you like us to wait a few more minutes, Mrs. Holloway?" "No." The word landed clean and final. The chairs remained empty. 5 in the front row, all facing forward, all accusing. The pastor began speaking. His voice echoed too loudly in the open space, every word stretching longer than it should have. The flowers were painfully bright. The casket shone as if polish could replace presence. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers locked together, afraid that if I loosened them, something inside me would fall apart in front of strangers who hadn't earned the right to see it. The service moved forward without them. At the grave, the coffin was lowered. The ropes creaked. Dirt met wood. The sound was dull, final, impossible to undo. The pastor murmured his last words. The groundskeeper stepped back. And just like that, it was over. Everyone left. Which meant no one left. I stayed. The earth was soft beneath my heels. The wind rose again, stronger this time, catching my coat and pressing it hard against my body. I slipped my hand into the pocket without thinking. Just to steady myself, just to feel something familiar. My fingers touched paper. Not a receipt. Not a tissue. Something folded. Thick. Intentional. My breath stopped. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. I stood there, staring at the fresh mound of earth, the name not yet carved into stone, the silence louder than any eulogy. Because suddenly, standing alone beside an unfinished grave, I understood this moment wasn't empty. It was waiting. And whatever had been placed inside my coat pocket, it had been meant for now. What was hidden in my coat? And why was I only meant to find it after everyone else stayed away? I didn't open the paper at the grave. I don't know why. Maybe instinct. Maybe fear. Or maybe some quiet part of me understood that once I unfolded it, whatever fragile balance I was standing on would collapse. So I slid my hand back out of my coat pocket and let the paper stay where it was, pressed against my ribs, warm from my body, heavy in a way paper shouldn't be. I walked back to my car alone. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few tire tracks cut through the gravel already fading, like proof that people had been here once and didn't plan on staying. I unlocked the door, sat behind the wheel, and rested my forehead against it for just a moment. Not to cry, just to breathe. The engine started. The radio came on by accident, someone laughing too loudly, a jingle too cheerful for a day like this. I turned it off immediately. Silence felt more honest. At home, the quiet hit harder. The door closed behind me with a hollow sound, and the house answered with nothing. No footsteps. No television murmur. No familiar clearing of a throat from the other room. I slipped off my shoes and stood there longer than necessary, still wearing my coat, still carrying the weight of the day like it might spill if I moved too fast. I walked into the living room. His chair was exactly where it had always been, angled slightly toward the window. The remote lay on the armrest. The blanket folded. Not neatly, just the way he liked it, ready to be pulled up at a moment's notice. The air smelled faintly of dust and something older. Something settled. I sat down, still in my coat. Only then did I reach into the pocket again. The paper came out slowly, like it didn't want to be rushed. It was folded more than once, creases pressed flat, the edges worn as if it had been handled and rehandled. I turned it over in my hands, noticing how careful it felt. How deliberate. But I didn't open it. Instead, my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. A notification. Social media. Faces smiling. Drinks raised. Sunlight. Someone else's life continuing exactly as planned. I locked the phone and placed it face down on the table. The paper waited. I stood and walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water I didn't drink, then carried the folded sheet with me down the hallway. Each step felt measured, like I was crossing into something I couldn't uncross. I paused outside the bedroom, my hand hovering over the doorknob, suddenly unsure why my chest felt so tight. I sat on the edge of the bed instead. The house creaked softly around me, the way it always did when the temperature changed. It sounded like breathing, like listening. I unfolded the paper just enough to see handwriting. Not typed, not printed, familiar. My fingers trembled, and that surprised me more than anything else. I had held myself together all day. At the grave, in front of strangers, in the car. But here, alone, finally, the steadiness cracked. I folded it back up. Not yet. Whatever this was, it had waited long enough. Could wait a little longer. I slipped it into the top drawer of the nightstand and closed it gently, like it might bruise. I lay back on the bed, still dressed, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the house, something clicked. Pipes settling, wood adjusting, time moving forward without asking my permission. And for the first time since the service ended, a thought took shape I couldn't ignore. What if the reason no one else came was the reason this paper existed at all? What was written on that folded page? And what truth had been waiting for me alone to face? I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the house relearn itself without him. Every sound felt louder in the dark. The tick of the clock in the hallway, the soft groan of the floorboards, the whisper of wind pressing against the windows like it wanted to be let in. The drawer beside me stayed closed. I knew exactly where the paper was. I could picture it resting there, folded and patient, like it wasn't worried about being forgotten. That somehow made it worse. Things that aren't afraid of time usually know something you don't. Sometime near dawn, I gave up pretending rest would come. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there, hands flat against my thighs, grounding myself in the simple fact that I was still here. The house smelled faintly of last night's flowers and something older, wood, dust, memory. I moved through it slowly, touching nothing, letting the quiet lead. In the kitchen, the sink was empty. No cups waiting. No plate set aside. The clock on the stove blinked 6 o'clock, frozen there like it had decided the day didn't deserve to begin. I made coffee anyway. The sound of it brewing filled the room, warm and familiar, almost comforting. I wrapped both hands around the mug and stood at the window, watching the sky lighten inch by inch. Somewhere down the street, a car started. Life apparently had places to be. My phone buzzed again. I didn't look right away. When I finally did, there were messages, short ones, delayed ones. Words like "sorry, busy, just found out." None of them asked how I was. None of them mentioned the funeral. They hovered around the edges of the truth without touching it. I set the phone down and went back to the bedroom. The drawer opened with a soft scrape. I lifted the paper out, careful, almost reverent. In the early light, I could see the ink more clearly now. The handwriting tilted slightly to the right, deliberate but unhurried. Every letter formed with intention. I traced the folds with my thumb. Still, I didn't read it. Instead, something else caught my attention: my coat, draped over the chair near the door. The same coat I'd worn to the cemetery. The pocket now empty, the fabric creased where the paper had rested. I stared at it longer than made sense, a strange thought settling in my chest. He hadn't slipped it there by accident. George never did anything by accident. I sat back down on the bed, the paper resting in my lap now, its weight undeniable. Whatever was written there had survived the hospital, the house, the days I hadn't known how to count anymore. It had waited through his absence and the children's silence. It had waited for me. My fingers moved to unfold the first crease. Then I stopped, because a different question rose up, sharper than the others, one I hadn't allowed myself to ask until now. What if reading it changed everything I thought I knew about the people who didn't show up? What truth was strong enough to be hidden, and dangerous enough to be revealed only now? I folded the paper back into my lap, not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I was afraid of what it might confirm. There's a difference. I stood and paced the bedroom slowly, the paper moving with me like a second heartbeat. The mirror caught my reflection as I passed. I looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, just thin, like something essential had been stretched too long. I wondered when my face had learned how to hold itself together without expecting anyone to notice. The house felt alert now, awake, as if it knew I was circling something important. I carried the paper with me into the hallway, then the living room. Sunlight crept across the floor, stopping just short of his chair. That chair had always felt like an anchor in the room. Now it felt like a witness. I sat there instead. The cushion dipped beneath my weight. Unfamiliar but not unwelcome. I held the paper up, studied the handwriting again. It wasn't hurried. There were no crossed-out words, no smudges. Whatever this was, it had been written carefully. Thought through. Finished. My phone buzzed again. This time I answered it. Not out of urgency, out of curiosity. Mom. Peter's voice sounded tentative, like he was testing the ground before stepping forward. I heard. I just found out everything's done. Everything. Such a small word for something so final. Yes, I said. There was a pause. I wish I could have been there. I didn't respond. He continued, filling the silence. Work's been crazy. You know how it is. I did know how it was. That was the problem. We'll talk later, I said, and ended the call before he could apologize again without saying what mattered. The phone felt heavier than the paper. I set it down and looked at the folded sheet in my hand. I thought about the timing, the care, the way it had been placed, not mailed, not left in the open, but tucked into my coat, close to my body where only I would feel it. Not before. Not during. After. A message meant for when the noise was gone. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, a neighbor pushed a stroller past the house, her head bent low against the cold. She didn't look up. Didn't see me. I didn't wave. I finally unfolded the first crease. Just the first. The paper opened slightly, enough for a few lines to show. But I stopped myself again, heart pounding now, louder than it had at the graveside. Because suddenly I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider. This wasn't just about what George left behind. It was about what he'd seen coming. And the longer I held that paper unopened, the more I realized. He hadn't written it to comfort me. He'd written it to prepare me. Prepare me for what? And why was I the only one who needed to read it? I sat back down before I finished unfolding it. Not because my legs were weak, but because something in my chest had gone tight, like my body understood what my mind was still trying to avoid. I held the paper with both hands now, thumbs pressed flat against the creases, and finally let it open all the way. The handwriting filled the page. George's handwriting. Steady. Familiar. The same careful slant he used on grocery lists, birthday cards, old envelopes he never threw away. Seeing it there fresh, intentional. Felt like hearing his voice again in a quiet room. If you're reading this, then I was right about two things. That was the first line. Not I love you. Not I'm sorry. Something colder. Something precise. I read it again. Then again. I was right about two things. My breath caught, not from grief but from recognition. George had always been observant in ways that made people uncomfortable. He noticed patterns. Silences. The things people stopped doing long before they stopped showing up. I continued. First, I knew you would be alone when it mattered most. Not because you deserved it, but because you always stayed after everyone else learned how to leave. My hands began to shake. Not violently. Just enough to remind me I was still holding myself together by force. I read the sentence slowly, feeling its weight settle. He hadn't written it angrily. There was no bitterness in the ink. Just truth written the way he always wrote it, clean, unavoidable. Second, I knew you wouldn't protect yourself unless I gave you permission. I lowered the paper. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had leaned in to listen. Permission. How many years had I waited for it without knowing? Permission to stop explaining. To stop forgiving before being asked. To stop making room for people who only came when they needed something. I lifted the page again. You've spent your life making yourself smaller so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable with how much you give. You called it love. I called it endurance. My eyes burned. I thought of all the quiet moments I'd dismissed. All the times I'd told myself this is just how families are. All the times George had watched without arguing, because he knew I wouldn't hear him until I was ready. The next lines were shorter. Careful. Almost restrained. What happens next is not your fault. And what you choose next is not cruelty. I pressed the paper to my chest, suddenly aware of how hard my heart was working. This wasn't a goodbye. This was a hand on my back. A steadying presence. I kept reading, but something shifted as I did. Certain names appeared. Not accusations. Not explanations. Just observations. Patterns written down without emotion. Dates. Absences. Excuses repeated often enough to become habits. George hadn't written a confession. He'd written a record. And as I read, I realized something that made my stomach drop. He hadn't hidden this letter from them. He'd hidden it for me. What exactly had George documented? And why did he believe I would need proof before I believed myself? I didn't finish the letter in one sitting. I couldn't. Some truths don't arrive all at once. They press in slowly, testing where you're weakest. I folded the paper back along its original creases, the way George always did, careful to line the edges exactly. It felt important not to rush him now, not after everything. I set it on the table and stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. Outside, the day had fully arrived. Sunlight filled the room, bold and unapologetic, touching corners that had stayed dim for years. It made everything visible: the dust on the shelves, the faint scuff marks on the floor, the quiet evidence of a life lived carefully for others. My phone rang again. I didn't answer. Instead, I went to the hallway closet and opened the lower drawer. The one with the folders. The one I hadn't touched in months. Inside were envelopes, statements, notes written in my handwriting and George's, organized the way we always organize things so no one else would ever have to clean up after us. I sat on the floor and pulled one folder out at random, then another, then another. As I opened them, the pattern George had seen began to take shape in my own hands. Dates lined up. Requests followed familiar rhythms. Emergencies that somehow always resolved once money changed hands. Long silences broken only when something was needed. I hadn't been imagining it. I'd been minimizing it. That was the part that hurt most. Not what they'd done, but how eagerly I'd helped them do it. I went back to the table and unfolded the letter again, this time skipping ahead. You will want to explain. Don't. You will want to soften the truth. Don't. They will call it anger. Let them. I closed my eyes. I could already hear the voices. The disbelief. The outrage wrapped in concern. The way love would suddenly be mentioned, loudly, urgently, like a currency they'd forgotten they needed until now. The final section of the letter was shorter, written more firmly. I didn't leave you instructions. I left you a choice. Choose peace even if it costs you people who only loved you when you were useful. My chest ached, not from grief but from something closer to clarity. George hadn't told me what to do. He'd trusted me to finally do it. I folded the letter for the last time and placed it back in the drawer, but not hidden now. Deliberate. Accessible. Like something I might need to return to when doubt tried to rewrite the day. Then I stood, straightened my shoulders, and did something I hadn't planned. I picked up the phone. Not to call them. To call the lawyer. As it rang, my hand trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that this was too much, too final, too unforgiving. And then another voice, steadier, older, familiar, answered back. Enough. The call connected. I took a breath and stepped fully into the choice George had trusted me to make. What decision could change everything, and why would it finally force the truth into the open? When you're ready, say continue part 7 final. This is where the opening hook fully makes sense, all threads tied together, and the moral lands clean, quiet, and unforgettable. The line clicked, and the lawyer's calm voice filled the room. Not intrusive, not urgent, just present, waiting for my words, waiting for the decision I was finally ready to voice. I'd like to move forward, I said. My voice sounded strange to me, stronger than I felt but still quiet enough to surprise me. Everything as we discussed. The lawyer responded with a brief acknowledgement, then guided me through the steps that had once felt like someone else's life. Papers to sign. Accounts to review. Instructions I'd always avoided because they carried too much weight. I followed them deliberately, methodically, feeling each action as though it were a bridge built from grief into purpose. Hours passed. The sun shifted. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light. And slowly, a space that had been heavy with absence began to feel owned. Not just by memory, not just by loss, but by me. My hands no longer trembled as they signed, no longer hesitated when choosing what would remain and what would be let go. I paused only once, looking at George's letter. Folded, patient, finished. I traced the creases with my thumb, feeling the echo of his presence. I could almost hear him whispering, "You were always ready. You just didn't know it yet." Outside, the quiet had changed. The wind no longer felt like accusation. The empty chairs no longer a reminder of betrayal. They were simply empty. And I realized finally that what they had left behind, the silence, the absence, did not define me. I did. I stepped onto the porch. The world stretched beyond the yard, ordinary and indifferent. Yet for the first time in years it felt mine to enter. The weight of carrying everyone else's needs, their excuses, their habits, I could set it down. I could walk forward without guilt, without apology. And in that space I laughed. Softly at first, then louder, as if discovering a muscle long unused. The sound startled no one. Startled me. I felt the tears come, unbidden, warm and honest. Not for him, not for them, but for me. For all the years I had waited for someone else to see the truth, and finally, for the first time, for myself. I went back inside. George's chair caught my eye. I touched the armrest, feeling the familiar curve beneath my fingers. Then I went to the drawer, pulled out the letter one last time, and placed it carefully into a box I had set aside for memories. Not hidden, not secret, safe, completed. I knew the calls would come, the questions, the excuses, the urgent reminders of a love they had only remembered when it suited them. But for once I wouldn't answer. Not immediately. Not until I had chosen the time, the way, the words, if I chose to speak at all. Because George had left me more than instructions. He had left me clarity, authority, permission, the power to draw lines, to set boundaries, to choose peace over performance, authenticity over pretense. I opened the front door, letting the light and wind wrap around me. The world waited unconcerned, ready to challenge or ignore. And I stepped forward anyway. Not because the past had changed, not because they would understand, but because I had. The letter had done more than reveal truth. It had delivered freedom. And I, at last, was ready. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that reveal what's left unsaid.